Hi, it's Cate, and I'm going to talk about water element and the depth journey in Master of You. So to start off with, I'm going to review some of the things that you've probably read in the book. So this is the cycle of identity evolution, where we have number one, like where you are in your identity, and everything outside of that is not you. So what you know is in the known, and everything else is in the unknown. So your target of where you want to be next is in the unknown. It's outside of where you currently are. And that leap to there is you then extending into the unknown, and that's number three, where you're trying to get there. So who you are expands beyond who you've been before, and that's you growing, and you become a bigger you, and that becomes your new identity. And the deal is if you do that, you're aligning to higher levels of order. That's how Jordan Peterson puts it, and I really like that. That you're expanding into the way you expand is you're actually grounded in higher order. In some of the other books I've read or philosophies I've read, from Ayurveda to even more, just like, I don't even know what to call it, but basically like success, like the modern success, and how to do it, is that you're following certain laws, you're following certain principles, and these principles help you extend into higher order. When we don't pay attention to that, there's actually an order to becoming a better version of ourselves, we degenerate, and we actually create a smaller us. And that, is usually happening from a fight or flight response, where we're afraid of the outside world and we're continuing to contract against that. And often people have habits that are degenerative when you find that their reality is becoming actually smaller and smaller, where their capacity is becoming smaller and smaller. And so that's, basically the opposite of what we're doing in here in Master of You. And some of the actions that are aligned with regeneration are that we reflect, that we analyze our risk and take aligned action, that we're organized, and that we are finding higher and higher levels of order. And yes, it takes courage. It takes a desire to extend into the unknown. I would even add to all of this, I would add surrender. There's definitely an element of surrendering that you don't know it all. And so you have to surrender. In Zen, it's called beginner's mind. You have to come at it from a place of curiosity. And curiosity is really essential to know what is beyond yourself. So curiosity and courage, these are the key emotional attributes or places for the emotional body to align, to extend into the unknown. And what I'm going to get into in this little lecture is what happens, like why there's a breakthrough cycles, why the cycle itself, why it starts to create shadow issues. And the way we're approaching this from Master of You is saying that, we're aligning ambition, and where we're finding orders, we're organizing the home, we're organizing our body, we're organizing our time. And when we do, we increase our experience of flow, where we're like aligned action. We feel very fluid in space and time. In the process of flow, what happens, and we'll get more into that in the following lessons, what happens in aligning to flow is it brings up all these issues in integrity. And so water is both flow and integrity. So flow is the positive side. Integrity issues are the negative side, but you can't have one without the other. So I'm going to explain a little bit about growth cycles and cycles of development. So each of these levels is a cycle of development. And a lot of this, I'm going to just write a developmental cycle. And what we're looking here is like a top-down approach to a spiral. So in the beginning, we naturally move through evolutions of development in our life, and often adults plateau. A lot of the research from this comes from the Integral Institute and Ken Wilber, and also Spiral Dynamics or Don Beck, and they rely on the whole history of psychology and evolutionary development. So they're pulling on a lot of the work from the past. So if we understand that humans can develop, that certain humans have a lot more capacity than others. And we ask ourselves, well, why is that? The way that it is explained, this word spanda is the natural pulsation of consciousness. So that's what spanda is. Spanda has everything to do with it. The nature of consciousness is to use contraction and expansion in order to experience more. And it's the nature of the universe expanding. We experience it in our own cells, just with the inhale and the exhale, the contraction, the expansion, with rest and digest. We can see it everywhere. It's in every cell of the body. That's constantly in pulsation between contraction and expansion. So the more we want to have aligned action, basically, if we want to step into a bigger dharma, this results from the spanda of aligned action and reflection. So that's the pulsation of contracting, and it's contracting in a positive way here. It's a contraction to actually stop and reflect. And then when you do that intelligently, then what happens is you take aligned action, because your reflection then influences you have higher intelligence, and that higher intelligence then says, like, this is actually what aligned action. So where I found this really helpful is what happens when we actually flip the spiral on its side. Because the spiral has always represented the pulsations of the opposites. And that's true in spiral dynamics, in that whole field of work, understanding evolutionary psychology. And so what we have here are cycles of growth. And I know there's a lot on this slide, and I'll just back up and actually draw some of this, because I think it will be helpful. So if we have a spiral and we have a cycle of growth, here we're calling it an evolution, and I think that's a better word for it, actually, because a cycle can just repeat itself. But this is really an evolution of growth. And as we tip that on its side, and we understand that the nature of the spot of becoming a bigger version of ourselves. So now we're just taking those circles of a bigger you, and we're saying that it's happening. The reason I'm using those diagonal type lines is because it's energetic. It contracts in order to expand, and this is really important to understand. The exhale, like in pranayama or breathing practices, the deeper you exhale, the more you can inhale. The same thing's true with fasting. Like, the deeper you go in fasting, the better your nutrient absorption. So there's very clear order. If we're going to align to a higher order in order to experience what we haven't before, we want to understand that this is how it works. This is the nature of the evolutionary cycle. So when we tip this on its side and we look at it just from a different angle, what we can see in the opposites, this is the midline. And in yoga philosophy, but it's actually, it's perennial philosophy. You can see it, you can start to see it everywhere in mythology and in archetypes that human consciousness picks up on. Is there's a midline. So here the midline is like, oops, that's not a straight line. The midline is like a tree. If we have it in terms of a human body, here's the head, and here's what's called the sushumna, or the main energetic channel, which is actually a vortex. It's the hollow channel that consciousness flows through. So if we lay it on its side, what we have is we have a cycle that's of growth, and we have a cycle that's of depth. And the Jungian, I'll actually bring up some of Carl Jung here, because Jung did some of the best work on this. And what he's saying is that one of his most famous quotes is, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." And what this is talking about is depth psychology, that there's stuff that we do not want to see. There's stuff that is out of order, is deeply out of order within us, and it's out of order in our thinking. The yogis would say we'd have a samskara, or we have a rut that keeps basically consciousness from just cycling the same pattern and not transcending into new levels of integrity, of new levels of also of capacity. This Carl Jung says it really well in terms of, you meet your destiny on the road you take to avoid it. And this is what will happen to you in Master of You, is that you'll notice that we're forcing growth in a way by aligning to growth and aligning our space to growth and aligning our strategic planning, our calendar, everything to growth. Stuff is going to surface. Something's going to come up, and that is good, and that is aligned. And we're going to look at how to look at that. This is a great other one-liner from Jung. Modern man can't see God because he doesn't look low enough. That should not be a question mark. That is a statement. So this idea that we have to look into our dark side is part of it. And the nice thing is the path will reveal it. Okay, I'm gonna read this longer quote by Jung. In many cases in psychiatry, the patient who comes to us has a story that is not told, and which, as a rule, no one knows of. So I just want to highlight that. Like there's a part of ourselves we haven't seen yet, we haven't brought to the surface yet, and that's really what the Reckoning Day is all about. To my mind, therapy only really begins after the investigation of that wholly personal story. It is the patient's secret, the rock against which he is shattered. If I know his secret story, I have a key to the treatment. In therapy, the problem is always the whole person, never the symptom alone. We must ask questions which challenge the whole personality. Now, Jung wrote this over 100 years ago, and a lot of what we know about depth psychology now and identity evolution and breakdowns and breakthroughs is that this perennial wisdom is that something has to die in order for a higher level to be reborn. And that's what he's sharing in there. And that's why in the very beginning of Master of You, and you might want to go back there when you get stuck, is you want to look into your personal story. That's why we start with Dharma, with like your whole picture. Now, this component about challenge the whole personality, there's parts of our personality that cannot survive. It cannot survive at this level. They have to be shattered because they're not aligned to higher order. And don't worry, it's not just you, it's universal, which means it's true for all of us, right? No one's personality gets out of here alive. Okay, so he also says shadow work is the path of the heart warrior. And what I want to bring up here is the reason it's the heart warrior is if you're not aligned to higher meaning or a noble purpose or a deeper dharma or an evolutionary contribution or however you want to say it, you won't make it. The work is too hard. It's too easy to just, let it go. Just keep on being who you were in the past. But we know from being in here together that that's not what it's about. Jung also said, in my experience, I have found that the solutions to all of life's most intractable problems are not found through any form of intellect or cleverness. They're solved simply by moving on. And we're going to look at what does that moving on actually look like? Now, it's not just Jung who says this type of depth psychology. If we go back to Rumi, who I think it was about 700 years ago, Rumi wrote this. He said, what hurts you blesses you. Darkness is your candle. So what we're getting a sense of here is that we have to go into the deep. And so now let's look at this, what this actually looks like in terms of what is in the deep. What is deep down in here? And a lot of what happens below the surface is the unknown. We can't see. It's dark. If this earth, this midline, this represents also that which is beneath the surface and that which is above the surface. So above the surface, there's light. Beneath the surface, there's darkness. And there's also water. And I'll show you this in terms of, this is actually interesting. When I was in Paris, I went to the Louvre, as many people will do. And I also went to the Picasso Art Gallery, also as many people will do. And I noticed right away a lot of the motifs around the depth psychology and this whole idea of how when you become more conscious, you face, here, let's look at a few of these. When you become more conscious, you actually get pulled into water. And there's a lot of water motifs where there's this idea that this is Andromeda, who's a star. She's a constellation. So she's also a mythic figure. And she's getting pulled out of the sky, and you can see they're chaining her up. It's really quite aggressive here. They're chaining her up. They're chaining her feet and her arms, and they're going to drop her into the ocean. And you see this in the Demeter myth as well. You see it in the Ishtar myth as well, which we went through in Reckoning Day. It's a very, very common theme that in order to basically ascend to the next level of who you are, you have to be dragged to hell and back. The bull iconology, the bull is the animalistic nature. It's the unconscious part of the self. And so this little god is getting basically kidnapped by the god of the ocean. Via the unconsciousness or via the mule. And because if we transcend into our unconsciousness and make our unconscious conscious, and that's exactly what Andromeda has to do, is she can't just be love and light. She actually has to have depth. Here's another way that is shown is here's let me see, who is this? This is the nymph and the scorpion in marble. You'll see the little scorpion down between her shins. And the idea is she's so naive that she has to get bitten by the scorpion in order to experience her depth, in order to have like the yin and yang, in order to have the darkness that matches the light, because only then can she expand into more light. And that's really the concept. That's really the concept of Spanda. There's a skeletal nature to this. It's like being stripped down. And we saw that in the Reckoning Day video of like, you really have to get stripped down to just your skeleton. That's the whole idea. So you don't even know who you are. There was a lot everyone who knows Picasso knows that he took a lot of time in exploring the bull, and the combination of the bull being the human, and that's both the darkness and the light side. The human has a higher ethical order, a higher moral order, and that's part of the noble aim, is to live up to a higher moral order. And it's that constant battle with the unconscious parts of the self that are not as integrated. And we can see this all in Picasso's art with the pulling apart of the different selves. I just wanted to show this one too. Here we have the Sushumna again, the midline. You can see it straight through the center, and there's a little umbilical cord. And then the branches out to the sides, and that's representing how the tree of life and the human and the midline of the trunk, the midline of the Sushumna, that this is how one extends from the center into the unknown. This also, I don't have an image of this, but if you can recall an image of Hindu gods or goddesses, they often have multiple arms. They often have like 8 arms, and that's symbolizing the branches of extending into the unknown. So all we're doing here is we're just turning that on the side, and we're saying, okay, this is the tree of life. So here's the tree, and here it's going beneath the surface, and here the branches are extending to heaven, right? That goes right back to Carl Jung. So in order to grow, the depth has to increase. So the roots have to go a little deeper in order for the branches and the trunk to extend a bit further. And the same thing is true of the human. The human needs to understand more of its depth in order to continue to grow. And so I'm going to show you some images of what this starts to look like. What I've drawn when teaching this in other webinars is we have the darkness and we have the light. The way this is taught in yoga, and when you have a good yoga teachers, they'll teach you how to root down through your feet in order to rise up. Or if you play basketball, your coach will teach you how to stay more towards your toes. Or I actually learned this in goalkeeping as well, because they're trying to jump up to catch the ball often. So can you be more towards your toes? Can you bend your knees? Can you sink your femur bones down and back? Can you get rooted in order to jump, in order to rise up? So when we are wanting to step into higher order, we'll start to recognize more of these laws of the universe. So the darkness, the female, that's all the depth cycle. It's queen in the shadows. It's why in all these different cultures, the princess or the goddess is pulled into the ocean and made to stay in the dark half the year. Then she can emerge and reunite with the upper kingdom, or with her mother, or with She'll often actually select a new partner at that phase. She won't be with the same person from before she went to her depth journey. And that is basically because she's at a higher order of power in herself. So she'll select a new mate at that order of power. Fascinating in mythology. This is how human consciousness developed. If we look a little bit, that depth brings us into integrity. It causes reflection and rejuvenation. And I've seen this so much in healing work, is that often people are out of sync with what they need to do on a daily and seasonal and annual basis to rejuvenate their physiology. And I hear ya, like, it's hard. It's hard in this day and age. Like, it's just, like sleep isn't considered like a necessity by a lot of people to have enough of it. So the same thing with doing nothing, with sitting in silence, with meditation, with reflection, with just lying on the ground and sitting next to a tree, just gazing at the stars, gazing at the clouds, like all of that, those habits enable the reflection and rejuvenation. And if we don't have that, we burn out. Now, what burnout looks like is regression. So instead of growing, remember that smaller you, that's regression. That's when we contract and get smaller. And people who've gotten really sick or burnt out or put on a lot of weight or become extremely depleted, what's happening is that their habits are so out of alignment often with what they need that their body starts to break down, their body gets sick, and then growth becomes impossible. And they have to just focus on depth of integrity at this point with the body, what your body needs. So that's just a little overview of the depth and the growth and how you have, this new level of skills, this higher order. I would also put in here that there's higher order. There's a higher magnitude of order that is necessary. And that's really what we're up to in this whole experience of water element. I find it very fascinating. I mean, I know that over time I can just see my cycles. And, when you're in the dark, it's scary, it's dark, you're not skillful, you don't have knowledge or wisdom. Remember that whole thing Jung said about like your intellect's not going to get you out of there? It's so true. So moving forward means moving deeper into depth. And that was what Carl Jung was saying in that statement. Around you have to move on. You have to move deeper into the depth. You have to be so curious. And in that, you have to dissolve your ego. You have to dissolve who you were before. You have to dissolve your identity and be in the unknown. And it's going to be uncomfortable. By nature, it has to be. But that's where you get your depth as a human being. And that depth enables the next cycle of growth. Whoop! And then, bam, you're shooting again for the moon. All right. So just reflect for yourself, like what has to be let go of? So there's something that's out of integrity. There's something that's out of higher order. We usually know exactly what it is too. So you trust your intuition on this one, where I think there's another. I love this from Pema Chodron. Nothing ever goes away until it teaches us what we need to know. Our shadows hold the essence of who we are. This is Debbie Ford. They hold our most treasured gifts. By facing these aspects of ourselves, we become free to experience our glorious totality, the good and the bad, the dark and the light. I'll read this by Langston Hughes in closing. She, in the dark, found light, brighter than many ever see. She, within herself, found loveliness through the soul's own mastery. And now the world receives from her dower the message of her strength, of inner power. Langston Hughes. So Jordan Peterson talks about chaos and order, and that's the known and the unknown. And so in the known, that's the egoic self, the personality that we know ourselves to be. In chaos, it's the feminine, and that's like it's Shakti. It's like the total creative ground where you can choose anything, and in that growth journey, you'll find your depth. In that growth journey, you will be forced to dissolve some part of the self. So the question is, what is that?